Good afternoon. I don't need to shout, I suppose. Can you hear me well at the very back there? Yes? Okay, great. Well, first of all, let me thank Laura Stark and all the rest of the organising committee for this invitation, of all the brilliant work that's gone into organising this event, putting the conference and the doctoral workshop together. I'm thrilled to be here and look forward to some great papers and discussions, very much at the cutting edge. We got a taste of this yesterday during the doctoral workshop, some of the fantastic work that's been done on mobile phones in the developing world. I'd also like to thank two people who can't be here today, namely Francisco Osorio at the University of Chile in Santiago, and Arnau Monterde, who is in Barcelona at the IN3, with whom I've done collaborative work on mobile phones, mostly in the context of Spain and Latin America. Right, so let me start by the title of the lecture. The title is one of those lectures where the title has remained the same. This doesn't always happen. So I'm pleased that on this occasion I managed to stick to the original title, which is Mobile Phones and Actual Changes, Big and Small, in the Global South, a Preliminary Exploration. Now, this focus on change in this talk is not accidental. It comes from a long series of conversations that we've been having over at the Media Anthropology Network. Some of you know this network. There are 1,400 people on the mailing list. It's been a bit quiet lately, but I'm sure we can revitalize it as soon as we find a postdoctoral or two who can help us out. But we've been going strong for about 8 years now, and it's a good venue for discussions related to media and communication. And it's not just for anthropologists. Anyone can join and take part. Now, I'm particularly grateful to Sirpa Tenhunen, who's here today, over there, and to Elisenda Ardevol for the shared enthusiasm for this topic under the theme of theorizing media and social change. We're currently putting together a co-edited volume on this topic of theorizing media and social change. Right, so after that background, let's get on with the topic of mobile phones in the Global South. This area, as we all know, has seen tremendous growth over the past 10 years or so, and it's doubtless one of the more vibrant areas within media and communication studies. It's a great opportunity to work in this field to carry on trying to internationalize the study of media and communications. If you compare mobile studies, say, with internet studies, it has less of that US-centered legacy that we've inherited in internet studies. And it's an opportunity which, as Ling and Donna argued a few years ago, we should take now before this window closes and mobile phones become even more normalized than they have become in recent times. There's an opportunity to study the relative novelty of these technologies. It's also an under-theorized field, as a number of authors have pointed out. So in this talk, what I'd like to do is take up this call for further theoretical development. There is nothing, I repeat, nothing more practical, in my opinion, than the practice of theorizing. We should theorize not for its own sake, not because we want to be fashionable and connect with metropolitan theories or ideas, but in order to ask better questions and in order to do better empirical research, which in turn will help us refine our theories in a two-way dialectical process. And I'm borrowing from Nick Coldry this take on the topic. Now, what I'd like to do briefly, because I do have a tendency to go on a bit, but I'll try and keep it nice and focused. What I'd like to do to start with is to think of how we may go about trying to theorize this deceptively slippery concept of change or sociocultural change, and how we may begin to overcome some of the hurdles that come with trying to grapple with such a complex notion. Now, my suggestion is that we think about change not in the present continuous, as we normally do, i.e. how things are changing at the moment. What are the emerging trends right now? But that we think of change, at least for the time being, in the recent past, i.e. that we revisit some of the empirical examples, some of the research that's been done on actual changes that have already taken place, and then try and work out what part, if any, mobile phones played in those changes. In other words, I'm not asking the question, what part are mobiles playing in current changes that are taking place right now? I'm asking instead the question, what part did mobiles play in recent changes in the developing world? Now, social cultural change is a mind-boggling notion. The moment we start thinking about change, the mind boggles and we end up with very abstract general points of discussion, and it becomes, we get muddled, in my experience. After all, change is everywhere. It is the hallmark of modernity, or so we are told. And it has been change has been integral to our popular and political culture for a very long time. Take, for example, Britain's former Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan's famous address to the Parliament of South Africa in 1960, when he said, "The wind of change is blowing through this continent." Or think of Bob Dylan, 4 years later, 1964, of his album, "The Times They Are A-Changin'." And this is precisely the trouble, that the times are always a-changing. So in everyday and media discourse as well, and academic discourse as well, change happens in the present continuous of how things are changing. And this shapes the way we put together grant applications, the way we talk about our call for papers, the way we produce scholarly publications, and also in informal conversation. So we tend to think about what's happening now and what's happening in the near future, what seem to be the trends that are now emerging. We may say that we're studying mobile phones and social change, and I include myself, but more often than not, what we mean is that we're studying social changing, change in progress. And we actually like these metaphors of emergence, of everything is blurred, everything is work in progress. We like these kinds of metaphors. Most of us suffer, I would suggest, from an undiagnosed condition we could call immanentism, the fascination with the immanent, with the present and the near future, with the emerging. And mobile studies, like the rest of media and communication studies, is no exception. Part of the problem, and I'm glad we have a few historians in the audience, I think they will like this particular line. Part of the problem has to do with the divide running right across the social sciences and the humanities, which is a divide, I don't mean a digital divide in an economic or technical sense, I mean an epistemic or knowledge divide separating media and communication scholars from, media and communication historians from non-historians. We don't seem to talk much with historians. Those of us who are not historians, we don't seem to hang out very much with historians, which I think is a pity. I think it may have to do with memories of textbook history at school. I've heard a number of social anthropologists say that, I won't name any names, that history is boring, which can be. I suppose it depends on how you tell it. Now, so what I would suggest to tackle this question of mobile phones in relation to actual changes is the following 8 principles. First of all, let's be specific about what we are discussing. Let's be specific about the changes. So, change is everywhere and anywhere at the same time. But if we talk about a change or a specific set of changes, this makes a difference. For example, a regime change in Tunisia in late 2010, or an environmental change in Sumatra following a tsunami, or a financial change in a local firm, or a change of marital status by one of our research participants when we're doing mobile phone research. So you can go from the very macro to the micro level and try and be more concrete about actual changes, a change in status from A to B. We can leave change in general, I would argue, to the work of social philosophers. After all, they like that sort of thing. Second point, let's also distinguish between past, present and future changes to get away from the present continuous. Third, for the time being, we can focus on changes that have already occurred in the recent past, i.e. on actual changes. Fourth, let us try and think of changes diachronically over time, because otherwise it's a bit like trying to clap with one hand. If you only take a snapshot of a situation and then you try and work out what's changing, yes, you end up with replies to what's changing at that particular moment, but you need, at the very least, to take that process at 2 or even better 3 or 4 points in time. We all know in my own field, in anthropology, we've been talking about multi-sited ethnography for at least 15 years now, but we also need to do multi-timed ethnography, and in other fields, multi-time research. It doesn't have to be necessarily ethnographic. Number 5, I suggest we think of changes processually as a process that has stages, and that we look at those and how people use mobile phones at each stage of that particular process of change. Changes go through a life course, a curriculum vitae, a Lebenslauf, not a life cycle. I suggest we treat changes as life courses with a beginning, a middle and an end. Collective socio-technical biography. Changes may be unpredictable, but they still have a processual form. They're not entirely random sets of events. Number 6, let's stay away from polemics around technological determinism. I think these polemics are generally quite unhelpful. So we can assume quite safely that ICTs, well, we shouldn't assume either that ICTs, such as mobiles, have played a key role, say, for example, in the Arab Spring uprisings, nor the opposite, that they are to be dismissed. Impact of a technology is open to empirical investigation, and that impact is likely to be quite different depending on which particular moment of that process you look at. And I'll give an example or two very briefly. 7, avoid another type of polemic that's very common in this kind of line of work, the polemic around how new is this new technology. You're calling it new, but what do you mean by new? I think that's also quite unhelpful. You end up going around in circles. I would suggest to silence that, in order to silence the non-believers in the novelty of a given technology, that we're more specific about dating that technology. For example, no one can seriously argue, but feel free to argue that in the Q&A. No one can seriously argue that Twitter is an old platform. It may have borrowed ideas left, right and center from previous platforms or technologies, but there is no doubt, if you believe Wikipedia, that Twitter was launched in 2006, not earlier, 2006. It's barely 7. It's a young technology. So it makes a difference whether we talk about this medium, how old and new is this medium. It makes a difference from actually naming it. Okay, let's be more specific. Twitter is most certainly a new medium, a new platform, I should say. Now, finally, number 8, in principle, all changes, big and small, matter. Only time will tell whether an accumulation of seemingly insignificant, hardly noticed changes at the local level, for example, will then eventually turn into a cascade of epochal transformation. So you can't really say until you've done the diachronic analysis that I'm proposing whether or not those seemingly small changes made any significant difference. Right, so to explore these ideas and how they could work or not work in actual research practice, I turn now to three literatures on mobile phones in the global south, namely political mobilization, markets and mobiles, and everyday mobile sociality. In other words, I'm about to explore these ideas by considering in turn mobiles in relation to political, economic, and social changes. These are broad categories, but hopefully after we've thrown this Humpty Dumpty of change and it's broken into pieces, we can somehow put it back together. That's my hope in any case. Now, let's start with political mobilization. This is an area of research where it's good to see that the global north and the global south from the very beginning have been central to the discussions about political mobilization. A good place to start is Howard Rheingold's book Smart Mobs, which came out in 2002. This is a journalistic account. It has serious problems which I can't go into, but at the same time Rheingold captures something that was beginning to be noticeable round about that time, the turn of the millennium. He gives examples such as Seattle in 1999, Manila in 2001, and many other examples of how mobile technologies amplify what Rheingold calls the human talent for cooperation, and in the process they change the world. So Smart Mob is an ad hoc grouping of protesters or people or fans, it can be any number of things, who are using mobile and sometimes also internet technologies to gather and do something in real time and then disperse often as quickly as they got together. Now, the best known example, which is often quoted by the social movements, who are interested in mobile technologies, is the case of Manila in 2001. As some of you will know, there was a process of impeachment at the time against the president of the Philippines, the President Estrada, who was accused of corruption. When it looked as if Estrada was about to get off scot-free, huge gatherings took place at the emblematic EDSA Square in central Manila, and many of the people who turned up, according to the reports from the time, had been called to the square through messages asking them to pass on the news of this gathering, of this crowd. And partly as a result of these protests, Estrada resigned. He is now, by the way, the new mayor of Manila, so he's still in business. But that was an example of how apparently mobile technologies played an important part in a process, in a political process. Of course, as always, other scholars have been critical of the supposed technological determinism. They've given more complex accounts of what really happened, and they, as you might expect, they say, well, it wasn't all about mobiles. We need to take into account many other factors, which is a very sensible thing to say in response to accounts such as Rheingold's. Now, 2 years later, after Rheingold published Smart Mobs, you may remember the terrorist attacks in Madrid, the bombs in Madrid, which were actually activated by mobile phones. And you may recall that the ruling party at the time, the Partido Popular, the Popular Party, conservatives, tried to blame the bombs on Basque separatists. Very quickly, news of the cover-up, because they had evidence that it was in fact a political Islamist attack, very quickly news spread, and via, again, text messages, a strong crowd gathered in front of the ruling party's headquarters. Surprisingly to seasoned observers, this appears to have changed, it appears to have swung the vote towards the other party, the Socialist Party, which ended up two days later winning the general elections. So again, it's used as a textbook example of the power of mobile technologies to make an impact and change a political process. More recently, many of you will be familiar with the work by Shirky, the book Here Comes Everybody, which came out in 2008, and he makes a similar argument to Reingold's, an optimistic argument according to people, critics like Morozov and others. Now, with the spread of online and social media that started or took off in earnest in the mid-2000s, and particularly since the wave of protests that we saw in 2011, there have been a number of calls for more holistic approaches to the media landscape where protests and uprisings take place. We often hear about the media ecology or the media landscape in which mobile and other technologies are being used. So a number of authors, I think, have plausibly argued that you can't simply look at the specific devices. You have to look at the wider, the interaction between old and new media within that media landscape. I think that's an important point, but it's important not to overlook the specific affordances of different technologies, including mobile technologies. So we want holism, I totally agree, but you also want to, you don't want to dilute everything into some undifferentiated mass of technology where everything has converged and you can't differentiate. You can still differentiate the different affordances, but again, you need to do it by looking at that process stage by stage and look at what I'm calling the mobile ensembles of technologies that are found at different stages of a process. There's a clear example of this in England in 2011 when protesters found, when rioters found that BlackBerry was the ideal technology to launch their riots, and Twitter, by contrast, was the preferred technology for the cleanup operation that followed the riots. So there were, I'm not suggesting it was just BlackBerry and it was just Twitter, but at different stages of those riots, a different mix of media was apparent, with some technologies being more salient or more significant, more important than others at different stages. Now, what about, you're probably wondering at this point, what about actual changes? This is all very well, but you promised us you would tell us about actual changes and how we can study them over time. Well, I have an example, not from an emerging economy, but rather from a sadly submerging economy, which is, happens to be my own country of origin, Spain. There are, I suggest, three complementary ways in which, three among many, but I'll just single out three ways in which you might study mobile collection action in a more diachronic, more historical way. First, you could study mobile collective action as a process of change in its own right. So you could go back to 2004 through historical research and look at those protests in Madrid and undertake a stage-by-stage, step-by-step analysis of their birth, development, decline, and demise, examining carefully the uses and effects of mobiles at each stage. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it could be, and I'm looking forward to examples from this conference of things like this that people are already doing. A second way would be to compare mobile collective action at two different points in time, in historical time, two different historical moments. For example, Spain is a really good place to do this because we have quite a lot of research that was done in 2004, and we have a fair amount of research from 2011, including my own work in Barcelona. So you could take what happened in Madrid in 2004 and look at how texting appears to have been one of the key applications, perhaps the key technological application that enabled collective action at very short notice at the beginning of this process. Mobiles probably were not quite as important later on, but they're very important for that first crowd of people that protested, and they provided an alternative channel of communication away from the mainstream media. And then you can come closer to the present day. You can fast forward to 2011 and look at how mobile phones were used in a much more complex media ecology. In only the space of 7 years, the media ecology of a country like Spain and many other countries has become much more complex. What we found in a recent study that I undertook with Monterde, with Arnau Monterde, we found that smartphones were very important as articulators of what was going on in the occupied squares when tens of thousands of people occupied the main squares of Spain. Smartphones were important to connect what was going on across different squares simultaneously in real time, but also with people, different publics, different audiences who were not connected to the protest movement, and articulating the mobile with the online, articulating Twitter in particular was a very important platform, and so was live streaming. So you have this ensemble, this mix of live streaming, Twitter, and use of mobiles on the ground, forming the historical change quality and the liveness quality of these events. It gave the events a very strong sense that this was a historical moment in the history of the country. Thirdly, another thing you could do to study mobile collective action over time is to borrow concepts from our colleagues from history, our historian colleagues. For example, the historian and social theorist William Sewell wrote in 2005, he developed this conceptual trinity of trends, events, and routines. In his case, he was looking at the labor movement in southern France. It was a completely different topic. But this trinity of events, trends, and routines can be used to track changes and continuities in a process of change, such as, for example, the uses of mobile technologies for political mobilization. Trends, according to Sewell, are those directional changes in social relations, and I'm quoting, that are marked by historians with terms such as rise, fall, decline, increase, and so on. Routines, and I quote Sewell again, are practical schemas that reproduce structures. And he defines institutions as machines for the production and maintenance of routines. And finally, events, for Sewell, are temporally concentrated sequences of actions that transform structures. I'm beginning to apply this conceptual trinity to the Spanish materials, but I look forward to hearing from other concepts that people here are using in their own diachronic research. So in the case of events, you could go back again to the 2004 events in Madrid and the 2011 events and look at how different mobile technologies were used there. And you would find that these events affected the routines that people had before the event. There will be a before and after in some of the routines, and of course also some continuities. And you will find, I guess, but I'm only hypothesizing here, that you will also find trends. You can plot some trends between those 2 points in time, 2004, 2011. Right, so moving on swiftly to mobiles and markets. If in the study of mobile collective action, Rheingold is the obligatory entry point. Here, in the study of mobiles and markets, we could do worse than quote the now almost classic work of Jensen in 2007. It's only 6 years ago, but it feels almost like a classic moment in this rapidly moving field of research. Jensen, as most of you will know, and his team collected data during a 5-year period among 300 sardine fishing units in 3 different districts in Kerala in India. This was between 1997 and 2001, and I quote Jensen, in that period a mobile phone service was introduced throughout Kerala, which is a state in India with a large fishing industry. Using micro-level survey data, we showed that the adoption of mobile phones by fishermen and wholesalers was associated with a dramatic reduction in price dispersion, the complete elimination of waste, and near-perfect adherence to the law of one price. Both consumer and producer welfare increased. Now, of course, a number of mobile for development researchers, M4D researchers, have stressed the complexity of the issues at stake in this kind of study, and they have questioned narrowly financial assessments of the supposed benefits of mobiles. For example, Jagan, Heeks and Wally suggest that although Jensen and others may well be correct in arguing that mobiles can improve market performance by meeting some of the, in quotes, informational challenges that hinder economic actors in the South, this may further disadvantage people without access to mobiles. Heeks is critical of M4D studies that define the costs and benefits derived from acquiring a mobile phone in simply monetary terms. Similarly, Donna has a few years ago argued that the benefits of mobiles are likely to vary considerably depending on the type of entrepreneurial activity, to the extent that some micro-entrepreneurs may have no need for mobiles. So if you look, for example, at taxi drivers and contrast that with the work by shoe shiners and knife sharpeners, you may find that the latter have no economic uses for this technology. Donna ends by suggesting that the M4D, the mobile for development field, requires a better taxonomy of those small businesses that are more likely to gain from specific technological features. Now, yesterday in the doctoral workshop, Sana Tower presented some very rich ethnographic material. Is she here? Oh, there she is, yeah. Sana Tower presented some very rich ethnographic materials, and she makes a similar argument in her case in the context of the Cameroonian grasslands, where she was working with traders. Conditions in Cameroon have worsened since the 1980s, and the structural adjustment policies supported by institutions in the north. Yet mobiles, mobiles have been integrated into the lives of petty traders, but again, mobiles in themselves don't remove the hurdles of poverty, poor education, and so on. And she also found that mobile money seems to be working quite well in many parts of East Africa, but not so much in West Africa for reasons that still need to be investigated. So these various critiques of Jensen's textbook article I think are important critiques, and they help us to understand the complexity of the issues. On the other hand, there always has to be another side to the story. I would suggest that if we're interested in mobile-related changes, both big and small changes, we have to be careful with this yes but type of argument. I've just realised I'm doing that myself now, but never mind. We'll cut this out from the YouTube presentation. So we're going to be careful with this yes but reaction to articles such as Jensen's or research such as Jensen's, because by yes but I mean the reaction that goes something like, yes, mobile phones are making a difference, but let's not forget that they don't change the status quo in any fundamental way. Which is true, but I wish to propose that we break this yes but device into its two component parts. That we look at yes, the yes side of it, and that we leave the but for a later occasion. And for the time being, concentrate our energies on the yes. This way, I suggest, we'll be able to see actual changes that have already taken place more clearly. We can leave the but for another day. So going back to that Cameroonian example, Tawa tells us that during her fieldwork in Cameroon, traders appreciated mobile phones for a number of reasons, including that they eased communication, they made them feel connected to friends and family, they facilitated business transactions, they reduced transport costs, and they also reduced trade-related stress. As Tawa may have noticed, when I listed those items borrowed from her paper, I've taken the liberty of switching the tense from the present tense to the past tense. So instead of saying, instead of the original wording that mobiles make them feel connected, I've changed that, if you don't mind, to made them feel connected at that particular point in time. Whether or not traders in that part of Cameroon will feel the same way about mobiles in 2014 or 2015 remains to be seen. So what I would suggest is that we need to look at those materials, at that research, and start by asking, okay, what are the actual changes? Let's look at them more carefully before we get on to the but side of those changes. We need to study those changes in their own right and not quickly move on to other matters. Finally, I'd like to talk briefly about, I've talked about the political arena and about the economic arena, of course, very superficially and briefly. I'd like to end with the social arena, to the question of everyday sociality and how mobile phones may be changing social relations on a day-to-day basis. Now, this area is another growing area of research, and it's one that has been of particular interest to ethnographers, including anthropologists. So here we could start with Horst and Miller and ethnography, the cell phone, which came out in 2006. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this work. It's based on their field research in Jamaica. And what they do in this book is that they interrogate, they challenge influential scholarly ideas about a network society or networked individualism associated with the spread of technologies such as mobile phones. And instead, they suggest that mobile phones, to understand mobile phones in a country like Jamaica, it's best to start locally rather than try and import ideas developed in places like the US. You start locally and you build up an understanding of that technology through ground-up theorizing. You theorize based on what you encounter in the field. So what they found, or what they argue, is that mobile phones do not spread a new form of networked individualism coming from the metropolitan north. In fact, mobile phones fit in very nicely with pre-existing Jamaican ways of networking around individuals networking through their contacts and friends and family. They call this phenomenon link-up. Mobiles help people to link up in new ways, but still within cultural patterns that are recognizably Jamaican. This is an argument that is analogous to an argument that Miller made with Slater about the internet in Trinidad in the year 2000. This doesn't mean, they argue, that there is no novelty when it comes to mobile phones. There are, of course, novel aspects to mobile phones, but these must be understood within the culturally specific dialectical processes, two-way processes, whereby people and things constitute one another. Now, according to Sirpa Tenhunen, who is here with us, there is a problem with this approach to mobile phones and local cultural differences. Building on fieldwork on mobile technologies in rural West Bengal in India, she argues, Tenhunen argues that media ethnographers such as Horst and Miller have a tendency to overstress social reproduction and social continuity at the expense of social change. And Tenhunen also takes issue with practice theories for overlooking people's critical faculties and the ability that people have to strive for change as human agents. Tenhunen regards mobile technology as a source of dynamism that shapes culturally specific social logistics. And she suggests that we need to pay much more attention, as I just said, to people's desire for social change. Thus, she shows how mobiles have given young women in rural West Bengal greater autonomy from their elders' surveillance, whilst at the same time and paradoxically reinvigorating traditional cultural norms such as kin-based reciprocity. Now, this article came out 5 years ago, in 2008, just over 5 years ago. There have been some developments within the theory of practice. Laura mentioned earlier the edited volume, Theorizing Media and Practice, which came out in 2010. In that volume, I argue that although practice theory is certainly no panacea for media and communication studies, it can help us, the theory of practice can help us with certain research areas, such as the uses of mobile phones and other technologies in everyday life. Now, a more recent publication came out only a few months ago. It's by Chauve et al. It's called The Dynamics of Social Practice. And Chauve and company asked the following questions. First, how do practices emerge, exist, and die? Second, what are the elements of which practices are made? Their answer is that there are material elements as well as symbolic and social elements. Third, how do practices recruit practitioners? Fourth, how do bundles and complexes of practice form, persist, and disappear? And finally, how are the elements, practices, and links between practices generated, reused, and reproduced? I haven't done this work yet, but I'm suggesting that taking these questions about practices, the sets of activities that people conduct on a more or less regular basis, taking these questions could be an interesting exercise. Like practice theories in other fields, one thing you could do as a researcher is shadow people as they go about engaging in practices such as fishing, trading, motoring, teaching, learning, drinking, and so on. But here, in this case, with an emphasis perhaps on the specific material element of these practices, and more specifically on the mobile phone elements of these practices. So in following those practitioners as they go about their everyday life, you could once again ask about actual changes that have already taken place, taking care not to fall into the yes but trap. So you would ask questions such as, what are the mobile related changes that have already taken place among these practitioners. Say, for example, taxi drivers in the early 2000s. So you choose a historical period and you focus on that. You try and find out as much as you can about that particular historical moment, and asking questions such as a before and after. I understand Laura is doing that kind of research. Are we running out of?
We're about 45 minutes.
Okay. And so you ask about that specific moment, what happened when these mobile phones, when you started using mobile phones in your practice as a taxi driver, what stages did that process go through, and how do we explain the part played by mobile phones? So, to conclude, I have been arguing, or I started off by suggesting that theorizing is not something that we do for its own sake, or because we want to keep up with metropolitan fashion. Theory is something that allows us to ask better questions, to do better empirical research, which in turn can help us refine our theories. How do we begin then to grapple with the huge but crucial question of mobiles and socio-cultural change? I suggested that we can start by not conflating the past, the present, and the future, and addressing, at least for the time being, actual changes that have already taken place. And I've tried to illustrate that through a number of examples from the political, economic, and social life in developing countries. I should clarify, before people start checking whether they're using the ing form, I don't want to introduce a ban on, let's not talk about how things have changed. I'm not suggesting we ban words, quite the opposite. The more words, the merrier. What I'm suggesting is it's fine to do stuff about emergent trends that are happening now, and it's great fun and it's important research, but it's also important that we don't forget the recent past and the not so recent past, and that we do some historical work, possibly with colleagues who come from historical disciplines. Thanks very much.